first, who is Homer, right? Let's chat a little bit about who Homer was and why we have these poems that we think are by him. So the answer to that question is actually way more complicated than you might like it to be. If you haven't already encountered this problem, it's sometimes called the Homeric question. Homer, if he existed as an individual person, existed so very long ago that we're just not quite sure about who he was. It's somewhere around the 7th or 8th century BC. So 700s BC. There come into being these poems. And we have these kind of distant records in history of a group of people called the Homeridae, who lived on the island of Chios, which is just off of Asia Minor, now Turkey. And this was a clan of people who claimed to be descended from a guy named Homer. And clearly, we don't know a ton about these people, but clearly they were part of this tradition of reciting poetry, of sort of standing around together in large groups or in concert halls, performance spaces, and reciting poetry. This kind of it was the entertainment, right? Along with things like sports. This was the way that people would gather together and entertain one another and pass on stories and pass on wisdom and all this stuff. There was this tradition of song. It's not written. This is kind of an important thing, right? It's not written down at this point. It's a tradition of bards, singers, memorizing this work. And somewhere along the line in that tradition, we get these two massive poems, way, way longer than probably the other stuff that was being recited. The Iliad is 15,693 lines long, and the Odyssey is 12,110 lines long. They're divided up into books now, but they are these kind of just giant, continuous epics that were recited. And more as this tradition caught on in mainland Greece, they became kind of cultural touchstones. People would gather to hear them recited. And they became almost like, it's like a combination of Shakespeare and the Bible, right? If you put those two things together, they have this immense cultural weight. People learn them in school, people memorize them, people quote them at each other, use them to have philosophical arguments. It's kind of like this repository of cultural wisdom that gets passed down in this oral tradition and then eventually written down. And by the time we get to, say, the 5th century BC in Athens, which is kind of the high classical period, that is where a lot of the stuff that you hear about in Greece comes from. By the time you get there, these are these already canonical texts. And so they stand really at the wellspring of all literature. And it's why it's so ridiculous to say you don't need to read Homer to learn classics, right? There is no classics. There is no classical literature without Homer. You can't not do it. It's just insane, right? To think that you can kind of say, well, this is optional. This is some sort of peripheral thing. It's not peripheral. It ain't peripheral to anything.